Ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, members of the diplomatic community, youngsters, fellow terrorist-sentenced colleague, I'm deeply honored to be invited by the Australian Embassy and Ambassador Kenna to deliver this Wallenberg Address. But believe me, I really wish I didn't have to. I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish that this morning I got a phone call from Asmara in Eritrea and a cracked voice said, "I am free, jag kommer hem." It did not happen. This morning, the Swedish Eritrean journalist David Isaak woke up in his cell 6,464 days after his arrest in September 2001. And so did 251 of his and my colleagues. I'm here on behalf of David and other colleagues that should be with us in this room today. A couple of months ago, I met with David Isaak's daughter, Bethlehem, and she told me about the last time she saw her father. She was 7 years old and heard a loud bang on the blue steel door outside the family's house in Asmara, Eritrea. And outside were two men with dark glasses. She studied them carefully and thought that they were friends of her father. "Is Isaak here?" they asked. "There is no Isaak here, but there is a David," shouted her mother from the kitchen, who had overheard their conversation. Bethlehem showed them the way through the garden, past the lemon tree, the grapes, the pottery with plants, and Sophia asked the men to join them for breakfast. David was still asleep, and she called his name to wake him up. He was a heavy sleeper, a workaholic, who always read something or wrote something, often a little absent, always with an article on his mind. A week earlier, his newspaper's permission had been withdrawn and because they had published a call for democracy from an opposition group. His colleagues had gone into hiding, but David had told his family and his kids that there was no need to worry. They would soon be up running again. And besides, in the drawer next to the bed were his family's Swedish passports. If something did happen, the Swedish cavalry would be there for them. After a while, David entered the kitchen. The concrete floor was still cold from the night, and Sophia served tea and hot bread. Bethlehem studied her father's face, and he looked calm, and that made her calm. And her mother put oranges, bananas, ham, Italian cheese, ricotta from the family's own cheese factory, Casa de Formaggio, on the table. And then she served the two police officers cappuccino. When the men had finished their cups, they told David he needed to come with them. "I'll be back soon," said David to Bethlehem, and went with the men. And then, just before he passed the blue iron door out to the street, he suddenly froze, turned around, and yelled, "Take care of my children. Make sure they go to school." That was 18 years ago. Today, we should honor him, not only for enduring more than 6,000 days in jail, but above all for the journalism that led him there. His contribution to bringing new blood into the Eritrean media industry has been immense over the years. And together with his colleagues at CETIT, they showed what journalism could be and should be, but too often isn't. But he paid a price for the generations to come, the highest price. He paid with his freedom. But looking back at David Isaak's life, I think that we must remember that at many points he faced a choice. He's intelligent, he's well educated, he could have chosen another profession, but the love for his country, for his fellow human beings, made him into a journalist. And he returned after years in Sweden and started a newspaper, and he continued to write. And this stubbornness is demonstrating a brand of moral courage that we need now more than ever. And courage is the only thing he is guilty of. And even though I'm free from my own prison, I will never be free from the memories or the sounds. The first screams were always the worst. the frightened sound before the first stroke, and towards the end, the abused prisoner was always silent. It was the sound of torture. 6 disease-ridden cells around a small yard with inmates coughing blood, overwritten with lice, fleas, and rats. But it was called Sheraton by the inmates because even if it was bad, the small dark cells where humans were kept like animals, standing chained in the dark, sometimes hanged upside down, beaten until they confessed their made-up crimes, were worse. Those cells were called Hilton. Humor is the last line of defense. Yesterday, many celebrated Eid, and I will never forget when inmates celebrated Eid in prison. It was a special time. The late Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi had just passed away, and the prison was buzzing with different rumors. There were whispering about Muslim leaders having been arrested and police officers being killed, and someone claimed to have seen tanks rolling past outside the prison, but no one knew what was going on. One fundamental issue seemed to be that the country's Muslims were demanding their constitutional right to religious freedom and that they should be able to choose their own leaders. And the government's response was violence, arrests, and crazy TV documentaries. And then there came a decree. Prayer was no longer permitted in prison. And you could hear a pin drop in the room. And I remember that despite that tensed situation, the Muslims in the room collected money and purchased a large, beautiful woven blue and white prayer rug. Then they dressed up in their best clothes, and as the sun sank outside the tin shack, they surged through the big cell, packed with 200 prisoners in silence. Then a young man from Mali, in a white tunic and a traditional headdress, stood up. Wearing silk from top to toe, he took a deep breath, and then he started to sing an almost bluesy song. And another prisoner translated. He prayed to Allah, to the forgiving God, that he should forgive us and show us mercy. And I remember that the young man from Mali put every scrap of energy into his song, and men from India to the east to Senegal in the west rested their foreheads against the cold cement floor and dreamt of their pilgrimage, shoulder to shoulder, barefoot on the rug. They called out into the night about the time that was fleeing from them, about the peace of God, but they did not pray for freedom. They prayed to become better human beings. And their faith was stronger than their fear for the committees or the guards, and they ignored the ban in praying. And that night, everything became crystal clear. It was not the police officers that kept us calm. It was not the machine guns or the guard towers. It was not the geography. It was the geography of fear, the fear of not being released, the fear of becoming sick, the fear of torture and death. And the praying inmates that night were afraid of nothing but God. And I will never forget them, because that evening they helped us all in that large cell to keep our dignity and humanity. And I will never forget their courage. After my own release, I gave a lot of thought on who would be the next person to stand on trial for doing their job if this development was not stopped. And after a year or so, I got the answer on Al Jazeera from Egypt, when Peter Greste and his colleagues were arrested. And what was referred to 10 years ago or so as a wolf at the door argument, namely that terror laws could be used against journalists, has now become a brutal reality in an increasing number of countries. The war on terror has turned into a war on journalism. And the Arabic Spring turned into an early African autumn. Imprisoning journalists with draconian legislation seems to be a cheap form of censorship without any consequences. And I'm sure the Egyptian regime studied the experience from Ethiopia before they went ahead and arrested the Al Jazeera staff. And to tell you the truth, now back in the field, wherever I'm working, I'm more afraid of lawyers than landmines. Because if one more country gets away with prosecuting journalists, none of us will be safe any longer. And it's just not countries like Turkey, Iran, China, or Egypt. The US is also plummeting like a stone in press freedom rankings as a result of its increasingly aggressive pursuit of whistleblowers. Last night, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's office in Sydney was searched by the federal police over articles based on leaked military documents that detailed clandestine Australian operations in Afghanistan. And the majority of the imprisoned globally, 70%, are facing anti-state charges, national security laws, such as belonging and being accused of aiding groups that authorities has stamped as terrorist organizations. And yes, terrorism is a serious threat to our societies. They can kill us, as on Drottninggatan here in Stockholm. They can blow up buildings. But it's only we as a nation, our own parliament, that can destroy our own hard-fought laws on press freedom and democracy. And we must ask ourselves, in the future, will correspondents dare to interview terror-stamped groups like the Afghan Taliban, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Al-Shabaab in Somalia? I think we need those voices so that our understanding of the world is not cut in half. I'm not saying it was better in the good old days. It has always been a dangerous profession. And I think the first correspondent to beat the grass was the Associated Press correspondent, Mr. Kellogg, who rode with General Custer to the Battle of Little Big Horn and was shot and killed. But I would dare to say that we now face a new situation. International conventions that has helped and protected us in war and peace has lost in respect. The conflicts are more messy. There's a lack of resources among the media companies, and most important of all, there is an insight among states, militias, and armies that violence against journalists works, and this has created a perfect storm. And in a situation where every rebel group has their own YouTube channel and every state has their own propaganda machine, a neutral observer becomes a threat to all actors at play. And by killing the messenger, groups have learned that they can silence the message. And I think that every time a colleague is jailed, attacked, the world needs to go bonanza. We must find this strength. It should be as if they were trying to fry a panda at the local zoo. It should be a crime against humanity, a war crime. And I know this might sound a bit grand, but I'm not really neutral in these issues. It's personal. Press freedom is the freedom upon which all others stand. And I think that if the Geneva Convention was written today, the journalistic mission would have been better protected. But with that said, there is a lot to do on our backyard too. I remember in 2009, I visited the massacre site on the island Mindanao in the Philippines, where 34 colleagues had been killed and buried with caterpillars. They were on the way to a press conference. 34 colleagues killed at the same day, at the same time. And outside the National Press Club of the Philippines, there is a monument that says, "Journalists know how to die." But after the massacre in the Philippines, there was also a debate among colleagues. Many said that we need to arm ourselves. We need to get a gun. We need to travel with armed protection. That's the only way to stay alive, since the government is not here defending us. Other people were saying, no, that's not the right way to go. Now it's more important than ever to be more professional in our reporting. Let the criminals check their quotes, just as the victims. Never be sloppy. Write down the best arguments from both the guerrilla groups in the jungle as well as the general. And by highlighting the ethics of journalism, that was the way to stay alive. In the Horn of Africa, it's burning hot in the daytime these days and freezing cold at night. And I don't know how David Isaac's prison looks like, but I know from my own experience that the one thing that prisoners of conscience fear more than anything else is to be forgotten. And when you are locked up, that is the greatest fear, and the support from the outside is what keeps you going. Speeches, campaigns, awards, it will not set anyone free tomorrow, but it will ease their day to day. David will know. He can go with his head high, knowing that he is there for a good cause, that the pain and suffering has a meaning, and that he is on the front line in a fight that has turned global. But I also think it's important to remember that he's not only a symbol, he's also a human being of flesh and blood, with a wife and 3 kids. And to demand his release is also to reunite a family that has suffered more in a mental prison over the years than anyone should have to suffer. And in a letter smuggled out back in 2005, Dawit Isaak wrote, "Hi, I thought an interrogation would only take 45 minutes maximum, but here it seems to take at least 45 months without one single question. I don't any longer know why I'm in prison, unfortunately, not until this day. Don't tell anyone about this letter. I'm in a glass bottle, and I thank everyone fighting for me to get me out of this dark glass bottle." And when I read these words by Dawit that was sent to his family members in Sweden, I sense that they will never break him because he's in peace with himself. Even though he's robbed of his physical freedom, even though he's robbed of his freedom to talk or be silent, the freedom to drink, eat, he knows, as does all prisoner of conscience, that he has it in him to keep the most valuable, the freedom nobody can take from you, the freedom to determine who you want to be. And Dawit Isaak is a journalist, and every day he wakes up is just another day at the office. In last year's Raoul Wallenberg Address, Dr. Helen Durham said in her speech that Mr. Wallenberg was a man of breathtaking courage. And I agree, but she also pointed out that he was not alone. And I find this to be a key point talking about Raoul Wallenberg's legacy today, that it takes a crowd to be brave, and it doesn't erupt from a vacuum. His actions that saved thousands of lives would not have been possible, she said, without clerks printing the safety passes, drivers, translators, and the political leadership behind the scene creating the mission in the first instance. And secondly, as was mentioned before, today we are all behind him, but that was not the case during the 1940s. And I think that if we are going to stop the hunting season on journalists and human rights defenders, we need to step up for them when they need our support the most. When they are arrested, when they are in jail, when they are pushing their boundaries, it's then they need our words of solidarity. Not 70 years later, not on the funeral as with Nelson Mandela, not when it's all over and it's time to share the glory or mourn the dead. And that is what I appreciate with the work that many of you in this room do with the different Raoul Wallenberg organizations and the movement for press freedom today, that we are focused on the present, inspired by the past. And there is a lot we can do together. We can publish the outsmuggled articles from our colleagues in jail and give them a voice. We can send newspapers and letters, postcards to prisons and give their guards a gentle reminder that we are watching, and let the censor in the prison work overtime. And there is for sure a growing movement for press freedom. I remember the hundreds of letters we received in the Kality prison. And I remember seeing the hundreds of thousands of tweets defending the Al Jazeera staff in Egypt, and the support for the colleagues in Burma recently. It shows that they can jail journalists, but they can never succeed in jailing journalism. And Peter Greste said after his release that whatever happens from here, we must not lose this extraordinary experience of solidarity. And I think that is a key lesson, to fight for the jailed as one. And when I think back of Dawit Isaak, of the 251 other colleagues that woke up this morning behind walls of corrugated steel and concrete, I feel sick to the stomach. But then I remember Dawit Isaak's picture, his face, the pictures of him smiling. And I think that in the end of the day, it's not us that are fighting for his freedom, but rather he who is fighting for ours. Thank you very much.
Well, Martin, there's so much to digest in that, and thank you for your passion and your inspiration and the concrete, practical suggestions that you've made to all of us. Now my pleasure to ask Peter Greste to add his remarks to those just made by Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is quite an honour to be following Martin and playing a supporting act. When I was in prison, or after I was released from prison, Martin wrote a wonderful open letter to me, and I never had the chance to thank him for it. He spoke about what freedom really means, and it was an incredibly important document. It was an incredibly inspiring piece of writing for me, and so I owe Martin an awful lot. Martin and I, in fact, our stories have a lot in parallel. Not only was Martin aware of what was taking place when we were imprisoned in Egypt, but I was also very aware of what he was going through, because in fact I reported on his imprisonment when I was based as a correspondent in Nairobi rather. I celebrated his release at the time, but of course never did I imagine that I'd find myself in such a similar position. But it's interesting because through our own unique journeys, we've come to very much the same sort of conclusion. What Martin calls the hunting season on journalists, I've come to regard as the war on journalism. And I agree with him when he says that one of the lessons that the authoritarian regimes have taken from the past few years has been that jailing journalists seems to work. Now, what I wanted to do today was talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons why I think we've found ourselves in this situation. And I'd like to go back to Afghanistan, which I think is a really illustrative example of what has gone wrong. See, I was a correspondent in 1995, and when I was there working for the BBC, we would do what I felt was responsible journalism. We crossed the front lines to speak to all parties to a conflict. That's what journalism is. We have a duty to give our audiences a complete understanding of everything and everyone that's involved in any particular dispute. And so we did that. And I remember one day a new group had come to the outskirts of Kabul, and we needed to go and speak to them. I also saw this as part of our own, not just as a professional responsibility, but I also saw this as a way of making sure that we had strong relationships with all sides, that everybody involved in the conflict in Afghanistan understood that we were not partisan, that we didn't have a particular axe to grind, that we would give everybody an opportunity to have a fair hearing, that we would interrogate all of their views. And so we put on our, we put on our body armour, we got in the vehicle, we put the BBC flag at the back of the vehicle, and we drove across the front lines. And as we approached the front lines, I remember seeing this turbaned head poke above the sandbagged barriers, and this guy sticks his head out and he sees the sign. He says, BBC, welcome to Taliban. He was a Taliban commander. We were welcomed by the Taliban, who didn't necessarily understand our ideology, who didn't necessarily understand and certainly didn't agree with our theology, but they accepted us as legitimate parts of the battlefield. And at the same time, governments all over the world encouraged us to go and speak to the Taliban because they needed to understand what it was that motivated the organisation and drove them to attack Kabul. We were observers to the conflict. We were not participants in it. But then let's fast forward to 9/11. And what happened was, of course, as we all know, we saw the attack on the Twin Towers in New York. And George W. Bush, thanks very much, George W. Bush stood before a special joint session of Congress. And at that session, he made one very important remark. He said that in this war on terror, you're either with us or you are with the terrorists. And what Bush did in making that remark was that he made it a binary choice, that you are either on one side of the line or you're on the other. You cannot occupy that space in the middle, that space which is absolutely crucial for journalism to function. Now, this is not a hypothetical idea. What George W. Bush did was change, and I'm not saying that this was necessarily a grand conspiracy, but that the effect of what he said was to make it a binary choice and turn a war over tangible things, over things that you could put your finger on, like land or water or ethnicity, and created a conflict over ideas. And in that conflict over ideas, the space where ideas themselves are transmitted becomes by definition a part of the battle space. Now, as I said, this is not a hypothetical problem. This is not some abstraction. When I went back to Afghanistan after 9/11, a couple of things happened. Al Jazeera got the one interview that I'd wager that every journalist in the world would have wanted to get as the attack was taking place on Kabul, and that was with Osama bin Laden. Now, at the time, Al Jazeera came under enormous criticism because it was accused, particularly by the US and its supporters, and the American government in particular, of advocating terrorist ideology. Now, I'd argue that Al Jazeera had a duty and a responsibility not just to give Osama bin Laden a platform, but to interrogate the ideas that inspired the Twin Towers attacks, that inspired 9/11. Nonetheless, despite all of the United States' commitments to press freedom, we saw a bomb fall squarely on the Al Jazeera bureau. Now, the Americans insisted initially that it was a mistake. They later acknowledged that they had attacked a target that they had come to identify as associated with terrorism. Those of us who were working there at the time, though, saw this unequivocally as a message. You will not speak to the other side. But I don't want to just lay the blame solely on governments here. A short time later, after Kabul had finally fallen, there was a convoy carrying a group of journalists from Jalalabad up towards Kabul. There were 5 journalists in total, including a wonderful friend of mine, Maria Grazia Catulli, a fantastic Italian journalist who I'd known for many years. And there was also an Australian cameraman, Harry Burton, an extraordinary character as well by all accounts, but who I never had the honour of knowing. The Taliban intercepted that convoy. They pulled all of the journalists out. They dragged them into the hills. They let everybody else go. And then they emptied the magazines of their Kalashnikovs into those journalists. And they insisted afterwards at a trial, they were captured and they were put on trial. And they said at the trial that they were acting on the orders of their superiors explicitly to go after journalists. Now, what we've seen since then is governments using national security as an opportunity to close down the space that journalism is able to operate in. Martin earlier spoke of what we've seen today in Australia, which is deeply concerning to me, and this is part of an ongoing debate. Now, I'm not going to enter into the details of this debate because I recognise that there are legitimate national security concerns. But here's what worries me. In Egypt, we, as Martin was, were accused of terrorism, of collaborating with a terrorist organisation, of being members of a terrorist organisation, of broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security. If you think about it, the idea of national security, the idea of terrorism, is so malleable, so flexible, that you can interpret it to mean pretty much whatever anyone wants it to mean. We all know broadly what terrorism is. We all have an understanding of what we think it is. But I'd wager that if I gave a pen and paper to everyone in this room and I will ask you to write down a definition of terrorism, we'd have a broad consensus around what it means in the middle of it, but the edges would be blurry. Now, I think that it is that blurriness of the edges which is a problem for us as journalists, because it allows governments the opportunity to redefine terrorism in all sorts of ways and in ways that genuinely threaten one of the most fundamental pillars of a functioning democracy, and that is not just the right but the responsibility of journalists to interrogate government and to hold them to account on behalf of voters. What we are doing, what Martin is talking about, what he spoke about so eloquently, is the need to defend what one organisation has described as the grey zone. Now, the grey zone is a concept which I find really interesting. By the grey zone, the organisation means this space that we require for journalism to function. It's that space that we need to disagree with one another. The grey zone would be impossible to have without free speech, without a free press. A free press depends on this grey zone. The grey zone means that we can live in a pluralist society. We can live alongside people who disagree with us. As journalists, the grey zone gives us the capacity to question those in authority, to challenge, to oil public debate. So what is it? Who was it that came up with this concept? Does anyone know? A democracy think tank, perhaps? Some group of academics? A few years ago, I think it was in 2013, a group published an online magazine. The headline was "The Extinction of the Grey Zone." The organisation that published it was Islamic State. Because Islamic State stated intention, they've set it out extremely explicitly, is the elimination of the grey zone, that space that allows for societies, pluralist societies, to coexist. They want to end the grey zone. It seems to me that in drafting legislation that increasingly narrows the space for journalism to operate, to interrogate the authorities, to interrogate the fringes of the political extremes in the way that Martin so eloquently described earlier. In closing down that space, what we are doing is precisely the job that Islamic State is committed to for them. What we are doing is undermining one of the most important foundations of any democracy. We're undermining the pillars that have created your country, Sweden, and ours, Australia, and made them some of the most peaceful, stable, and prosperous places on the planet. Now, this system isn't perfect. It's deeply flawed. Journalism is a human construct, and as we know with anything that involves human beings, we get it wrong. Not just some of the time, but a lot of the time. But there is a wonderful French philosopher, Albert Camus, who said that a free press can, of course, be both a good thing and a bad thing. But a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.